An angry stranger storms into a cafe pointing fingers at Barron Trump. What happens next is a conversation so unexpected it leaves everyone questioning their own assumptions. It was a crisp afternoon in downtown Philadelphia, and the quaint cafe buzzed with soft chatter and the gentle clink of coffee cups. Barron Trump sat near a window, a quiet figure absorbed in a book. His tall frame, dressed casually in a simple hoodie and jeans, blended with the ordinary patrons around him, or so he thought. This was his haven for the day, a moment to escape the whirlwind of public scrutiny tied to his last name. Here, among strangers sipping their cappuccinos and scrolling their phones, he hoped to disappear into the background. The hum of conversation was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, angry voice that pierced through the cozy atmosphere. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Heads turned to the source of the disruption. A man in his late 40s stood near Barron's table, his expression fiery and confrontational. His clothes, though clean, bore the wear and tear of someone familiar with struggle. His voice trembled, carrying a weight that went beyond the words he spoke. Barron looked up, startled but not intimidated. His fingers rested lightly on the edges of his book, his gaze meeting the man's with a calm curiosity. "Excuse me," Barron said, his tone polite but firm. The man took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists. "People like you. You get everything handed to you. Do you even know what it's like to struggle? To lose everything?" The room fell silent, the weight of the man's accusation hanging thick in the air. The barista froze mid-motion, her hand hovering over the phone. Barron closed his book deliberately, placing it on the table as if to signal his undivided attention. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but engaged. "I'm not sure what's upset you, sir," Barron said evenly. "But maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed, his voice rising. "Talk? What could someone like me possibly have to say to someone like you?" The cafe seemed to hold its breath, every patron frozen in anticipation. The man's anger filled the room, his words trembling with frustration. "You have no idea what it's like out here," the man spat. "You sit there in your fancy life, reading your books, while people like me are out here fighting just to survive." A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The barista exchanged a glance with a coworker, unsure whether to intervene. The tension was palpable. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please sit," he said, his voice steady and calm. The man hesitated, his fiery demeanor flickering for a moment. He glared at Barron, then at the chair, as though debating whether to accept the invitation. "Why would I sit with you?" the man barked. "You'll never understand someone like me. You can't." Barron's gaze remained unshaken. "Maybe I can't, but if you sit, I'd like to hear what you've been through. Everyone deserves to have their story heard." The man's fists loosened ever so slightly, but his shoulders remained tense. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his emotions a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The cafe was so silent that even the faint hiss of the espresso machine felt loud. Finally, the man grabbed the back of the chair and dragged it noisily across the floor. He sat down heavily, his arms crossed defensively, his eyes locked onto Barron. "You really think you can listen to someone like me? Fine, I'll tell you," he said, his voice still sharp, but now edged with a hint of vulnerability. Barron nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening," he said softly. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as though he were steadying himself before plunging into deep waters. His voice, though quieter now, carried a rawness that silenced even the faintest whispers in the cafe. "I used to have a good life," he began, his gaze fixed on the table as if afraid to meet anyone's eyes. "A steady job, a family, a life I worked hard to build. Then the factory I worked at shut down. Overnight it was gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but empty promises that they'd relocate us, promises that never came true." The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Barron sat silently, his expression calm but empathetic, giving the man the space to continue. "I did everything I could," the man said, his voice cracking slightly. "Odd jobs, anything to keep food on the table. But when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to knock you down. My wife, she couldn't take it anymore. She packed up and left, taking the kids with her. He paused, his hands trembling as they rested on the edge of the table. His tough exterior was crumbling, exposing a raw, vulnerable core. And I don't blame her, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The cafe was utterly still, the usual background hum replaced by a quiet reverence for the man's story. Even those who had been scrolling on their phones or chatting moments ago were now glued to the unfolding scene. Do you know what it feels like, the man continued, his eyes finally meeting Barron's? To walk into a room and know everyone is judging you? To see them look at you like you're nothing? Barron nodded slightly, his voice soft but steady when he finally spoke. I don't know your exact pain, he said, but I do know what it's like to be judged before anyone even knows who you are. The man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. What would you know about that? He asked, his tone skeptical but no longer harsh. Barron leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. More than you might think, he said. Everywhere I go, people assume they know me because of my name, my family. They don't see me, they see a symbol, someone they can blame for their frustrations. It's isolating. The man blinked, his anger momentarily replaced by a flicker of surprise. He studied Barron as though seeing him for the first time. You're saying you feel judged? The man asked, his tone a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Barron nodded. I'm not comparing my life to yours. They're different. But I do know what it feels like to be misunderstood. To have people decide who you are before you even speak a word. The cafe remained silent, the tension slowly shifting into something more contemplative. The man leaned back in his chair, his defensive posture softening slightly. I guess I never thought about it that way, he admitted reluctantly. You seem so untouchable. Like you don't have to deal with the stuff the rest of us do. Barron tilted his head thoughtfully. I've been fortunate in many ways, he said. But it doesn't mean I haven't faced challenges, pain, judgment, loneliness. Those things don't discriminate based on who you are or where you come from. The man's jaw tightened as he processed Barron's words. Around them, the cafe patrons exchanged quiet glances, their initial discomfort replaced by an unexpected sense of solidarity. I came in here angry, the man said after a pause, his voice quieter now. I saw you, sitting there, and I thought, here's someone who has it all. Someone who's never had to fight for anything. Barron nodded slowly. It's easy to make assumptions about people we don't know, he said. I've been guilty of it too. But when we take the time to listen, we realize there's always more to the story. The man rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze dropping to the table. Maybe I've been carrying this anger for too long, he murmured, almost to himself. Blaming people like you for things that were never your fault. Barron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the man's words settle, giving them the weight they deserved. Finally, he said, anger can be heavy. But letting it go, that's where change starts. The man looked up, meeting Barron's gaze. His eyes, once filled with fire, now held something softer, maybe understanding or perhaps the beginning of acceptance. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cafe was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of silence that had filled the room earlier. Now there was a sense of reflection, of people thinking about the conversation that had just unfolded before them. The man's face had softened, his posture more relaxed. Finally he spoke, his voice much gentler now. You really think we can just let go of the anger? Barron met his gaze, his expression calm but sure. I think we can. But it's not about forgetting what's happened or pretending it doesn't hurt. It's about understanding that anger doesn't fix things. It only keeps us stuck. The man exhaled deeply, almost as if releasing a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in the conversation, his eyes seemed tired, but in a way that suggested relief, not defeat. You're right, the man admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it's time I stop blaming everyone else. Maybe I need to look at my own part in all this. Barron gave him a small, understanding nod. It's not easy. But even the smallest shift in how we see things can make a big difference. The man remained silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of Barron's words. Then slowly, he stood up, his movements deliberate, as if every action carried new meaning. He looked down at Barron, his eyes reflecting something he hadn't shown before, respect. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for listening, for showing me that maybe it's not everyone else that's the problem." Barron smiled, a quiet, genuine smile. "I think we all just need to be heard sometimes." The man extended his hand, and Barron shook it firmly. The handshake wasn't a grand gesture, but it held a quiet power, an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection they had made in that brief exchange. As the man made his way to the door, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted again. It wasn't dramatic, but it was tangible. The anger had dissipated, replaced by something softer. A collective awareness that the world was a bit more complicated than anyone had first assumed. The barista, who had been watching the exchange from behind the counter, smiled faintly. A couple of patrons who had been watching, their eyes wide with astonishment, now exchanged smiles of their own. The tension that had gripped the room seemed to melt away, leaving behind a renewed sense of understanding.